Welcome to our deep dive. We're tackling The End of Faith by Sam Harris today.
Oh, this is going to be a good one.
Yeah, you said you were ready to be challenged, and, well, Harris doesn't pull any punches. It's a deep critique of faith, especially in the modern world.
I've heard it's pretty controversial.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Even someone like Alan Dershowitz called it a must-read. He compared the dangers of faith to, get this, the tyranny of, totalitarian regimes, both religious and secular.
Wow, that's a strong statement.
Right. So right off the bat, Harris points out this idea that most people base their whole lives, whole societies even, around these religious doctrines.
Uh-huh.
And each one claims to be the only right one.
Right.
And he's like, well, that kind of automatically builds in intolerance, doesn't it?
It's true. If you think you have the only white truth, everyone else must be wrong.
Exactly. And he has this quote, certainty about the next life is simply incompatible with tolerance in this one.
That's powerful. Think about it if you're absolutely sure about heaven and hell.
You can't just tolerate other beliefs, can you?
It's like they become a threat almost.
And Harris isn't afraid to point out that we're kind of scared to criticize faith. Like, it's taboo, right?
Yeah, you're not supposed to question it.
So even when, terrible things happen, violence even, and religion is a factor,
I kind of tiptoe around it.
like with terrorism, Harris uses this example of a suicide bomber in Jerusalem. And he's like, why are we so hesitant to acknowledge the role of faith there?
It's fascinating, isn't it? We blame politics, economics.
But faith is off limits.
Like it can't be examined.
To explain this, he makes this comparison between faith and, well, alchemy.
Alchemy, huh?
Yeah, back in the day, alchemy was the way to understand the world.
Until chemistry came along.
And suddenly, poof, alchemy's gone, replaced by something based on evidence experiments.
So he's saying we need that kind of revolution for spirituality and ethics.
That's exactly it. Ditch the old texts, the dogma.
Move towards something evidence-based.
Okay, now this part surprised me. He's really critical of religious moderation.
You'd think that'd be the good side, right?
I know. But he argues that it's part of the problem.
How so?
Well, he says moderates don't actually challenge the extreme interpretations enough.
Oh, I see.
They kind of just water down the really dangerous stuff instead of, offering a truly new approach.
So instead of evolving, it's just diluting Iron Age philosophies, as he puts it.
Ouch. So, if we can't blindly follow old texts, how do we even approach spirituality today?
Well, Harris argues that true spirituality doesn't need dogma. He uses the example of, love and compassion. Those existed before religion, right?
Yeah, of course.
So instead of scripture, we should focus on things that actually work. Meditation, mindfulness, that sort of thing.
Practices, not preaching. But then he kind of hits you with this list. All the horrible things done in the name of religion. Slavery, witch hunts.
It's a pretty bleak picture.
It's like he's saying we've been ignoring evidence for centuries.
Clinging to comfortable beliefs, even when they lead to awful things.
And this leads to his concerns about Islam. But, and I want to be clear here, he's not saying all Muslims are bad or Islam itself is bad.
No, of course not.
It's more about specific doctrines, martyrdom, jihad, things that in the wrong hands can be really dangerous.
Especially in today's world.
Like he uses the example of suicide bombers, the celebrations after. It's like, is that really just about politics?
There's a deeper ideology at play. He talks about the Muslim world being awash in apocalyptic fervor.
So he's saying certain parts of Islam, combined with modern problems, create a unique danger.
Exactly. And he even challenges the whole war on terror idea. He says it's like declaring war on murder. It's the wrong target.
We need to get to the root of the ideology itself.
Right, because then he brings up the scariest thing of all, Islamist regimes getting nukes.
Now that is terrifying.
Imagine a regime that believes in paradise after death, and they have the power to destroy entire cities.
It's like a nightmare scenario. And he doesn't shy away from it. He even suggests that a preemptive strike might be the only option.
Wow. It's like choosing between two awful choices.
And then he throws another curveball. He starts talking about the Arab world, how they're economically and intellectually behind.
Yeah, I remember that part. He had some shocking stats, like the whole Arab world's GDP being less than Spain's.
It makes you think,
Yeah.
right? He connects this back to the need to question faith itself. Not just reform it, but really scrutinize it.
Like we do with any other idea.
Because even if they became super rich tomorrow, the core problem might still be there. He uses examples like Osama bin Laden, educated, wealthy.
And still a fanatic.
So it's not just about poverty or ignorance.
Huh?
Okay, I'm going to throw out the final curveball for this part.
Hit me.
Harris says this thought experiment. Imagine a weapon that can make people suffer unbelievably, but it doesn't kill them.
That's dark.
I know, but he's trying to make a point. How would we use that? Would we? And how is that different from accepting collateral damage in war where innocent people die?
Oh, that's deep.
It makes you confront your own morality, doesn't it? And this is where he gets to his most controversial argument, the one about torture.
Oh, boy.
But we'll save that for next time. This is already a lot to process.
Okay, so remember that thought experiment, that weapon that causes unimaginable suffering.
Yeah, it was pretty intense.
Yeah.
Like, where does that even fit in with the whole torture thing?
Well, it's all about this kind of like blind spot we have, morally speaking. Think about it. We're horrified by the idea of torturing someone,
Right.
even, a suspected terrorist. But then we're okay with collateral damage in war.
I see what you mean. It's like one's deliberate and the other.
It's kind of accidental, even if we know innocents might die, even children.
Hmm.
And that leads to this really controversial argument Harris makes. He says in some extreme cases, torture might actually be the lesser of two evils.
Oh, wow. Like, I knew this book was going to be intense, but that's a whole other level. I can already imagine the arguments about that.
Oh, absolutely. It's deeply unsettling. And even Harris admits that. But he's asking us to really examine those gut reactions. Like, are we reacting ethically, or is it just, squeamishness?
So he's not saying we should just start torturing people.
No, not at all. He's talking about these incredibly specific, hypothetical situations, like that ticking time bomb thing you see in movies, where someone has info that could stop a huge attack.
But even then, it's still...
It's a horrible choice, right? But he's saying in those cases it might be ethically justifiable, especially if it means saving a ton of lives.
It's like those thought experiments you hear in philosophy class. The trolley problem and all that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Harris is making us face the fact that our instincts aren't always right, and that sometimes there are no easy answers. And this makes me think about something else he talks about. The whole thing about attention and how it shakes our lives. It's almost like a bridge to his ideas about meditation and spirituality.
You're right, there is that connection. Like, he's not just saying faith is bad. He's saying there's another way to find well-being, even spiritual insight, without all the dogma.
And that's where meditation comes in, right? He talks about it transforming your whole experience, even dissolving the sense of self.
Yeah, he leans a lot on Buddhist philosophy there. That idea that the self is an illusion, not really real.
That's a tough one to wrap your head around.
It is, but he's not saying you have to believe it blindly. It's more about experiencing it. Like through meditation, you start to see how impermanent everything is, even your sense of who you are.
It's like think of it as a character in a video game. It feels real while you're playing.
But it's not you, really.
Yeah, it's a construct.
That's a good analogy. It's like those optical illusions. You see one thing, but it's actually something else completely.
That's a great way to put it. He even compares it to discovering your blind spot. You don't know it's there until someone points it out, and then you can't unsee it. He's saying the self might be kind of like that.
A blind spot in our own awareness?
Yeah.
But okay, if there's no self, then what? What about all our experiences, our relationships, everything that makes us feel like, well, US?
That's where it gets even more interesting. Harris says, recognizing that the self is an illusion doesn't mean those things are less important.
It's not like life becomes meaningless.
No, actually, he says it can make you appreciate them even more. Like you start to see the connections between everything. But okay, let's get practical here. If we're not following old scriptures and we're questioning this whole self thing, how do we figure out meaning and purpose? Where do those come from? Well, Harris believes those things come from, living authentically, with compassion, focusing on things like love, creativity, knowledge. Those things are already part of being human, right?
I guess so, yeah.
So he's saying we can access that without needing scriptures or dogma.
So it's a whole different way of looking at spirituality, more about what you do than what you believe.
Exactly. And he's not saying you have to completely ditch religion, but saying we need to hold it to the same standards as anything else. Question it, test it.
No free passes just because it's faith.
Right. Because to him, faith is kind of like this intellectual blind spot. It's believing things without evidence. And that can lead to all sorts of problems. Personal delusions, even global conflicts. He brings up 9/11, how it was driven by religious extremism.
And that brings us back to his concerns about Islam. He says, the link between belief and behavior raises the stakes considerably. Like, we can't just ignore these things because they're uncomfortable to talk about.
Absolutely. But again, it's not about hating Muslims or Islam itself. It's about being honest about the dangers of certain interpretations and being willing to critique them, but respectfully. It's a tough balance.
So, like, where do we even go from here? What's the takeaway for someone listening to all this, trying to make sense of it?
That's a great question, and it's something we'll keep exploring in the last part of this deep dive. But for now, maybe just think about your own beliefs. Are they based on evidence, reason, or just because you were raised with them, or because they're comforting?
And how do those beliefs fit into a world where, extremism is a real threat?
It's a lot to think about, that's for sure. But I'm really curious to hear what Harris has to say about moving forward.
Okay, so we're back for the last part of our deep dive into the end of faith. It's been a lot to take in so far,
Yeah, Harris really gets you thinking.
for sure. So after all this, like, where do we even go from here? Does he offer any, like, solutions, with faith being such a powerful force, but also a potential danger?
Well, he doesn't give you a step-by-step plan or anything,
Hmm.
but he does have these kind of guiding principles, like intellectual honesty is a big one, being willing to really examine what you believe.
Not just accepting things because they're familiar or comforting.
Right. Ask yourself, is there actually evidence for this? Does it make sense logically?
So it's about being willing to be wrong.
In a way, yeah. And that leads to the next thing, dialogue. We need to be able to talk about this stuff honestly and openly, even when it's tough, even when we disagree.
He's really against that whole idea of, like, protecting faith from criticism, like
Yeah.
it's sacred or something.
Right, because then those ideas, even the dangerous ones, can just fester. It's like what we're doing right now, discussing his book, even the controversial parts.
Exactly. Engaging with it, not shutting it down. But all that being said, he still stresses the importance of compassion.
Yeah, that comes through. Like, even when he's critiquing beliefs, you can tell he's doing it from a place of concern.
It's like, okay, these ideas are dangerous, but the people holding them are still human. So it's a balancing act, right? Being critical of ideas, but respectful of people.
That's a tough one for sure. But he thinks it's essential for, dealing with all the challenges we're facing. Extremism, polarization. We need to find ways to coexist.
And that takes a clear head, being rational, but also being humane. It's a tall order, but
Well, if we don't even try.
it's not going to get any better. Well, that's it for our deep dive into the end of faith. It's definitely given me a lot to chew on. I mean, Harris really lays it all out there.
Yeah, no sugarcoating. He makes you confront some uncomfortable truths about, well, everything. Human nature, faith, the world we live in.
And whether you agree with him or not, he raises questions that we all have to deal with. Like, what role should faith have in the 21st century? How do we balance belief and action? How do we even make ethical decisions in a world this complicated?
So as you go about your day, think about it. Are your beliefs based on reason? Are you willing to have those tough conversations with people who see things differently? And are you doing it, with a bit of compassion, trying to actually understand?
That's the challenge, I think, finding that balance. And who knows, maybe that's the first step towards a better world.
One conversation at a time.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We hope it sparked some thoughts, maybe some arguments too. Ha ha. And until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep those conversations going, and keep diving deeper.